All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Big Muddy Speaker Series. This is a presentation put together by Missouri River Relief, generally the second Tuesday of every month. And it's really super to see such a huge list of folks that have joined us today. Absolutely awesome. And I think this is maybe for us the farthest away that people have tuned in, but we do have a few friends checking in from Costa Rica. So shout out to Kevin, Patty, and Tutal. Thanks for checking in, you guys. So we are excited to bring the speaker series back in action. We took a little break last year towards the end of the last half of last year. So just to kind of get you up to speed, what we're thinking is possibly in April, we'll start doing the speaker series in person again. Still ironing out the details for that. But hopefully that'll be at Les Bourgeois Bistro, where we've done that for many years. So keep posted. We'll keep our website updated. That's bigmuddyspeakers.org. And again, my name is Steve Schnarr. I'm the director of Missouri River Relief. And we're the folks that try to put this together. I've been working on the speaker series for 11 years, I think. And this year is really exciting because a lot of the planning is being put together by Kristen Schulte, our education director, with a ton of help from Anna Miller, who's our education assistant AmeriCorps. And they have already scheduled most of this year out, which I could never do. So it's pretty cool to have such professionals on the backside of this. A couple things that I want to let you all know about. We do have the next several months are scheduled. I'll share those with you. On March 8th, we're going to have some of the River Relief staff led by Elisa Thomas, our Stewardship AmeriCorps member, talking about the Big Muddy Clean Sweep, which was a large cleanup effort we did on the Missouri River last fall from Kansas City to Columbia, covering about 200 miles of the river. We certainly didn't get to clean up every 200 miles, but it was kind of an astonishing project, and really looking forward to hearing what Elisa has to say about it and some of the awesome pictures that she took and other people took, and great stories from the river. And I'll probably hop in there too and tell a story or two. April 12th, we've got Claire Jackson and her dad, Stephen Jackson, who are both MR340 veterans. I know Claire's done it multiple times, but they're going to do a presentation about their experiences in the 340, which are kind of varied, and really looking forward to that. So that hopefully will be our first in-person Big Muddy Speaker Series since this pandemic started, which is pretty exciting. A couple other things we have cooking. April 9th, we'll be in the Kansas City area in Sugar Creek, actually, just a little downstream of Kansas City, doing a river cleanup at La Bonite Park. So you can find out about that on our website, riverrelief.org. And then some partners of ours the weekend before there's a couple just awesome, huge cleanups happening April 2nd. So Project Blue River Rescue, from what I understand, this is the 32nd year of that program, centered out of Lakeside Nature Center. And it's hosted by the Friends of Lakeside Nature Center, as well as Healthy Rivers Partnership, and really a whole bunch of organizations and partners in the Kansas City area. One of the biggest cleanup efforts in that area, April 2nd, Project Blue River Rescue. On the same day in the St. Charles area is Mission Clean Stream, hosted by Greenway Network, and just a bunch of towns in that area. So there'll be people cleaning up all over St. Charles County on that day as well. So look into those, greenwaynetwork.org. You can find out about Mission Clean Stream. The real reason you guys are all here today, and I got to check in, it looks like we have 105 people. I'm pretty sure that's the most that we've had on Zoom, which is pretty exciting. And you guys are here to learn about Missouri steamboat history. And you are in for a huge treat because we're joined by author and historian James Erwin, excuse me. And James is a retired attorney from the St. Louis area. And he is also an author with his wife, Vicki Berger Erwin. He has written 2 books that I know of, and James can fill in if there's more as well. Notorious Missouri, 200 Years of Historic Crimes, which I will be ordering soon. I can tell you that. And then the subject of tonight's talk, Steamboat Disasters of the Lower Missouri River. Now, James is the current vice president of the Kirkwood Arts Commission. He's also an interpretive guide at the Missouri History Museum, and he is a treasurer of the Unbound Book Festival, which is happens here in Columbia, Missouri, in every spring. And maybe James can fill us in on the dates this year if they've got that worked out yet. And this is our first time tapping into the Show Me Missouri Speakers Bureau, which is put together by Missouri Humanities Council and the State Historical Society of Missouri. James is one of that panel speakers. And so those folks are kicking in, part of the funds to make this happen, to get James to join us tonight and share his stories of Missouri River steamboat disasters. And I do want to say too that just recently, an episode of Beyond Oak Island, which is, I believe it's a History Channel series, trying to find treasure throughout the country. He appeared on the most recent episode that, it was one that came out a couple weeks ago, which was really about some of the steamboats that have been recovered, including the Steamboat Arabia, which I'm sure James will touch on tonight. As well as some others that the Howley family has been trying to find in mid-Missouri. So look that up. We've got it linked to on our website as well. So you can check out that latest version of that. But James, thank you so much for joining us, and go for it.
All right,
enthrall us.
I'm going to go ahead and share the screen then. Okay, let's see here. There we go. Thank you very much for having me tonight. Just a word about the Unbound Book Festival. It'll be April 21st through 23rd. Maybe also, I think there may be an event. There may be an event on the 24th and possibly one on the 21st. If you go to the Unbound Book Festival website, you can get all the details there. So thank you very much for the plug for that. Right here. Imagine being on the landing at Jefferson City in the 1850s. The steamboat's coming up the river. You can hear it before you can see it. There's a rhythmic cannonade of exhaust every few seconds. A chug, chug, chug. And around the bend, you can see smoke and soot shooting out of 50-foot chimneys. Riverboat men called the what we would call smokestacks chimneys. They have their own lingo, actually. You can hear the piercing scream of the steam whistle as it announces its arrival. And as the steamboat approaches the shore, you can hear the boilers pant. And you can actually see them visibly expand and contract, and you can see the open fires that are feeding the boilers. And in the current, the hull of the steamboat twists and it bends, and the whole vessel is creaking and groaning with heavy machinery pounding away. And just a few inches above the water, the deck is littered with stacks of wood, merchandise, bags, bales, horses, cattle, mules, and people. And as the boat gets closer to the landing, you can see it's frail, thin superstructure with the dozens of passengers not only crowded on the main deck, but those who pay a little bit more On the boiler deck, the one above the main deck, where the cabins are located. And above it all is a towering pilot house. Now, with this description, it's easy to see why the steamboat was derided in the 19th century sometimes as just an orderly pile of kindling, and why Charles Dickens, after riding a steamboat to St. Louis, wrote that the wonder is not that there were so many fatal accidents, but that any journey was made safely at all. And yet, the Western River steamboats that plied the Missouri River from St. Louis to Montana were technological marvels that were superbly adapted to the needs of river transportation in the 19th century. Well, if that's true, why did more than 300 steamboats sink in the Missouri River? And the lower Missouri, between Omaha and the mouth of the river, became known as a graveyard for steamboats. Well, partly what made the Missouri River steamboat so successful was also what made it susceptible to disasters. But there were other reasons for those kinds of disasters, beginning with the river itself. But before I get to that, a few quotes about the river. From Steamboat Bill Heckman: "We used to separate the men from the boys. At the mouth of the Missouri, the boys went up the Mississippi and the men went up the Big Muddy." There we go. Father Jacques Marquette, one of the first Europeans to see the Missouri River, wrote about what he saw after he passed the mouth of the Missouri while going down the Mississippi. He said, I've seen nothing more frightful, a mass of large trees entire with branches that came from the river. The water was all muddy and could not get clear." And of course, since we're talking about steamboats and we're talking about the rivers, we have to have a quote from Mark Twain: "The Missouri River is too thick to drink and too thin to plow." Well, the Missouri River, at least in this particular photograph, appears to be kind of a large, placid river. It is the longest river in North America, but it's not the same river, it wasn't the same river in the 19th century as it is today. Today, it's been straightened, cleaned in many places, maybe not as clean as we'd like. I saw from the pregame show, you had plenty of things taken out of the river. It's been cleared in lots of places, and it's been modified by levees and dams. The lower Missouri River, what I would call from the about Omaha to the mouth, was in the 19th century a sandy river. The banks were very unstable. The river was deeper and wider than it was in the northern part of the river, the upper river. There were many loops and bends that went all around in kind of a spaghetti-like thing almost, that changed many times from year to year, caused by the regular floods. The spring rise that came from the snow melting in the plains, and the June rise that came from snow melting in the mountains. The river could create new islands. This is Cora Island. The Cora number 2 steamboat wrecked downstream from St. Charles, Missouri. Within a couple of weeks, it was covered up by sand and silt. And within a few more weeks, it created an island, which remains there today. It's now a fish and wildlife preserve. What the river gave, it could also take away. In the 19th century, Weston, the beautiful little town that we know today, was an important Missouri River port. But in the 1870s, there was another large flood, and it changed the course of the river, and Weston is now 2 to 3 miles from the banks of the river. Before that occurred, there were several steamboat sinkings nearby. The Oddfellow was sunk by a snag in 1850, and the Admiral was sunk by a snag in 1858, both near Weston. And near the mouth of Bee Creek, south of Weston, is where the city of Portsmouth was sunk by a snag in 1861. The Blackhawk was sunk by a snag in 1862, and the Rialto was sunk nearby by a snag in 1864. If you notice a theme there, you're correct. They were all sunk by snags, trees that were in the river. And when people think of steamboat disasters, they usually think of boiler explosions. And these were the most spectacular and the most deadly kinds of disasters, and I'll talk about a couple a little bit later. But they were relatively rare. By far, the most common cause of steamboat sinkings were the snags in the river. About 2/3 of all the steamboats that sunk in the Missouri River were sunk by snags. When the waters of the river ate away at the banks in a flood, or the bends and the loops in the river, they'd sweep away trees and other debris. Sometimes they said that when it swept away enough trees at once, it would sound like a battery of artillery hitting the water. This is just an example of one of the large trees that was removed by a snag boat from the Missouri River. And the river itself was not only full of these snags, but all other kinds of debris that came down the river, in addition to all the sand and silt that it carried. But the snags were a constant hazard of navigation all through the history of the Missouri River. The second most common cause of steamboat disasters was fire. They were wooden steamboats. They had paint, dried paint, turpentine. They had open fires. They had sparks that were emitted by these tall chimneys, although they would put tar paper on the roof of the boats to try to alleviate that. And for many years, they really didn't have any firefighting equipment, maybe a barrel of water, but that was about it. This is a view, an image of the Great Steamboat Fire of 1849, where 23 steamboats were caught fire in the levee St. Louis, and ended up being destroyed, and also destroying a significant part of the town. The next most common cause of steamboat disasters was ice. Ice that would come down the river in the winters and would catch the boats when they were docked at the levees, at the landings, and throw them around, crack them up, and break them up. This happens to be from, looks like December 12th, I believe that was around 1876, this particular ice disaster. But the steamboats themselves, as I said, carried the seeds of their own destruction. And to illustrate that, I first need to do a little bit of a brief history about steamboats. This is a painting of the Western Engineer from the Robidoux Museum in St. Joseph. The Western Engineer was one of the very first steamboats to come up the Missouri River. It's a little bit difficult to see. It's kind of fuzzy in this image, but here on the bow of the boat was a very unusual thing. They put in a serpent's head and they piped the steam and the smoke out through the mouth of the serpent, and it was to be emitted there. The idea being that it would be to frighten the Native Americans as they came up the river. Native Americans are probably more worried about the guns that were being carried on the boat. And you can see it had horses and things with the these little fences things on the side to keep the horses and the mules on the boat. This is another view of the Western Engineer, a little more, not quite as realistic looking, but it does illustrate some of the characteristics of the boat. The Western Engineer design was based upon that of deep water boats, blue water boats. It had a very narrow hull that was very deep with a deep keel. It had a sail. The steam engine was a low pressure steam engine. I'll talk about that in a minute. It was located below deck. It was steered from the poop deck here and towards the stern of the boat, and the passengers and the cargo were carried below the deck. And here, of course, you can see where the snakehead was. But that was quickly discarded as being totally unsuitable for use on the Western rivers. In about 10 or 15 years after the Western Engineer was on the river, the more classic lines of the steamboat were developed. This is a steamboat, the Bertrand. It was built in 1864 and is a typical steamboat from the mid-19th century. It has multiple decks. The boiler deck, where the boilers here are, or the main deck rather, had the boilers. The boiler deck, interestingly enough, was the one above the boilers up here where the cabins were. And then it would be a hurricane deck, and the larger boats that had yet another deck was called the Texas deck. The steam engines were on the main deck. The boiler, the firebox was on the main deck. Cargo was carried on the main deck. Deck passengers were carried on the main deck. The hull looks very shallow here, and it was very shallow. It was only about 5 feet deep. The boat was long, it was about 160 feet, and it was wide, about 35 feet or so wide. The reason for that being that it could go on the shallower waters because it did not need a deep keel. It needed to be able to go across sandbars and deal with the various depths of the Missouri River, which could vary from as little as 4 feet up to as much as 35 or 40 feet, depending on where you were and what time of year it was. This happens to be, the Bertrand happens to be a stern wheeler. Up until about the time of the Civil War, the most popular kind of numerous kind of steamboat was the side wheeler. The reason the side wheeler was more numerous than the stern wheeler was primarily because it was more maneuverable. You could run one paddle wheel forward and the other one in reverse at the same time, and then you steer the boat and much more maneuverable than you could do with a stern wheeler at the time. It had caused some problems though, because first of all, with all the debris in the river, the paddle wheels were not really protected, and they could be subject to being clogged up by debris or being damaged by debris, logs and other things that came down the river. And plus the side wheels took up a good deal of deck space, which could otherwise be devoted to cargo. But by the mid-19th century, technological developments, particularly having to do with the rudders, made the stern wheelers much more maneuverable, and they became the most numerous kind of steamboat from the Civil War time on, primarily because they could in fact carry much more cargo. Now the Bertrand hull, as I said, was only 5 feet deep. But when it was fully loaded with several hundred tons of cargo, it still only drew 4 feet of water. Mark Twain famously declared that a steamboat could run on a heavy dew. George Fitch, who was another steamboat writer, was quoted as saying that steamboats must be so built that when the river is low and the sandbars come out for air, the first mate can tap a keg of beer and run the boat 4 miles on the foam. Now this thin, shallow deck, though, made it subject to having the hull punctured by the snags, those trees that were swept off the banks by floods and erosion. And if you punched a hole in that hull, why, this boat could sink in a matter of minutes. I want to point out something else. There were spars located on these boats, and these were used for what was called walking the boat or grasshoppering the boat, which was used when they had to cross over sandbars, which were frequently encountered on the Missouri River. And what they would do is they would take the spars, lower them till they were about a 45-degree angle in front of the boat, and then with the capstan, either by hand or by steam-powered capstan, pull the boat up until the spars were down at a 90-degree angle, and then he would put them back up again, and then put them out at 45-degree and pull the boat again until it was over the sandbar. Mark Twain commented on this process in one of his books when he talked about going from St. Louis to St. Joseph on a steamboat. He said it was very tedious because it seemed like they walked most of the way rather than cruised. Now the engines on these steamboats quickly were switched from low pressure to high pressure engines. Reason being that the low pressure engine did not have enough oomph. When you tried to go up against the current of the Missouri River, you needed a good deal of power. That's why a sail or something like that was simply not feasible. And so they switched over to high pressure engines, which were somewhat more dangerous to operate, but they were very simple. They were very rugged. They were very easy to repair, which was an important consideration because there were no repair facilities on the Missouri River after you left St. Louis, and they were easy to operate by persons with little training or experience. And they did provide that extra power that was needed to go upstream against an often powerful current. Now, the high pressure engines were very tricky to use though. The engines used water that was pumped from the river. The river is the Big Muddy. And so it was full of sand and silt and other debris. And that water had to be heated and converted to steam. And the boilers could be easily clogged with silt and sand. And at least initially, they often had to be cleaned as often as every 15 hours. And somebody would have to climb inside the boiler and clean them out. Now here's some photographs of the Arabia. Here's the boilers of the Arabia. You can see if you had to climb inside that thing and clean them out every 15 hours, it was quite a chore. And so there were some developments that were applied that made that a little less of a problem. This is a mud drum where those supposedly most of the sand and silt would be filtered out. Another problem was that when they pulled into a landing and the engine stopped running, well, the pump started running because the pump was powered by the steam engine. To get around that, they created what they called the doctor, which tended to cure that problem. And the doctor is this thing, which is an auxiliary steam engine, and it was used to continue to run the pumps, even though the boat's main engine might have been stopped. Steam gauges were a much later development. They didn't really come along until the mid-19th century or even later. They used what were called tricocks, which had three of them, one above normal water level, one at normal water level, and one below water level. You'd open it up, and if water came out, you were in good shape if it was at the top. If it was at the normal level, you were in good shape, but you had to watch it. But if no water was coming out at the bottom level, you were in big trouble. You had to make sure you get some water in there. They didn't really have any way to gauge how much actual steam pressure was there, but they did have safety valves, and this is one on the right from the Arabia. But you can judge the effectiveness of those safety valves yourself by the fact that they were called death hooks in the industry. They were easily tied down or jammed to allow the steam pressure to build up and to rise when they needed extra power. Despite these safety issues that faced the operation of the steamboats, they were, as George Fitz said, perfect for conditions on the Missouri River, where there was a low grade of fuel, a low grade of water, and a low grade of management. But improper operation of the steamboats, and particularly the steam engines, could lead to disastrous boiler explosions. One of the first was the Big Hatchie, Herman, Missouri, July 23rd, 1845. The Big Hatchie pushed off from the landing at Herman, and the boiler exploded almost immediately, scalding several people to death and the blast killing many others. There were 35 German immigrants who died in that explosion, but their identity was unknown because the boat's papers were destroyed. And this is a photograph of the monument to those unknown German immigrants that's in the cemetery in Herman, Missouri. Now you'll notice that the date on here says 1842. I don't know why it was wrong. It was 1845 when the disaster occurred. In those days, the captain could be tried for a criminal act of hiring a negligent or unqualified engineer. And so the captain of the Big Hatchie was put on trial just for that. But the evidence came out that the engineer that was operating the Big Hatchie was in fact one of the most qualified and most experienced engineers on the Missouri or Mississippi rivers for that matter. And it turned out an investigation proved that the cause of the explosion was nothing that the engineer did or didn't do, but it was an internal crack in the boiler. An even worse boiler explosion occurred in 1852. This is Lexington, Missouri in the 19th century. It's a little difficult to see in this slide, but in those days, there was a very large bend just upriver from Lexington. And this is the beginning of it here, the Lexington Bend. And it was very difficult to get around that bend. The current came around that bend at a considerable speed. And in the spring of 1852, it was even worse because it was still bringing ice downriver. The Saluda had been chartered by immigrants, members of the Church of Latter-day Saints, Mormons. These folks had traveled from England, Scotland, and Wales, first to New Orleans, and then up the river, up the Mississippi to St. Louis. They needed a boat to bring them up to Cantsville, that's up near Omaha, where they would get on a wagon train and go out to the Promised Land in Utah. But the Saluda was the only one available, so they chartered it. The Saluda was an old boat. Missouri River boats usually didn't last more than 3 years. The Saluda was about 6 years old, about the average time that a boat on the Mississippi lasted. The Saluda itself had already been sunk once below Rocheport, had stayed underwater for about 8 months, and then was raised and rebuilt. But nevertheless, the folks got on the Saluda, came upriver from St. Louis, got to Lexington, and made 2 or 3 attempts to try to get around the Lexington Bend, but without success. And on the morning of Good Friday, April 5th, 1852, the Saluda was going to make another attempt. What happened next, or the cause of the explosion that happened next, isn't known for sure, but the likely cause was the fact that the engineer probably let cold water into the boilers to create extra steam to get around the bend. The Saluda pushed off from the landing at Lexington, The wheel went around 3 times, and after the 3rd time, it exploded. There was a tremendous explosion. It killed about 75 passengers and injured many more. One of the persons who was watching the Saluda get underway wrote about what happened next. He said the current caught the wrecked boat and threw it back against the levee where it was tied up, the bow resting against the shore with the lower forward deck above the water and the stern several feet below the surface. As I ran down the hill, the first thing I saw was the boat's safe lying in the road, back at what is now the waterworks powerhouse. The safe was intact. Chained to it was a dead yellow spotted pointer dog. This was about 70 yards from where the boiler explosion occurred. In the flat just west of the powerhouse was the dead body of a large man lying with his face downward and his limbs extended as if he'd been sailed through the air like a rock. Every thread of clothing had been blown off his body. A sheet was soon spread over him, and he was identified as Captain Francis Belt, the commander of the boat. The citizens of the Lexington rallied around the survivors. They buried the dead, they cared for the injured, and they even adopted a couple of the orphaned children. Some of the artifacts from the Saluda still remain, are available to be seen today. On the left is a door that was taken from the Saluda. A man named Caspar Gruder bought some of the remains of the Saluda and used it to build a home, and this is one of the doors. He's also one of the people who adopted one of the orphans. He adopted a girl named Mary Kramer. On the right is the bell from the Saluda. It was recovered and was sold to a minister from Savannah, Missouri for $17.50. He took it there, and it's still there. You can see it outside the Savannah First Christian Church in Savannah, Missouri. Those steamboats were subject to a number of other hazards that we cover in the book: ice, bridges, disease, crime, hostile Native Americans, during the Civil War, guerrillas, and sabotage. But now I want to talk about some other things having to do with the steamboats. Now, you've heard of the famous race, I'm sure, between the Natchez and the Robert E. Lee and the Mississippi River, probably the most famous steamboat race, but they were fairly common. And I want to tell you now about the longest steamboat race that ever occurred, one of whose participants met its untimely end on the Missouri River near Chamois. I hope I pronounced that correctly. At 4:30 p.m. on March 27th, 1866, the W.J. Lewis, shown here, left St. Louis with 260 tons of cargo, drawing about 3.5 feet, headed for Fort Benton, Montana Territory. Its captain was Ed Herndon. Its pilot was Carroll Jones Atkins. Atkins, incidentally, was paid $800 a month for his services as a pilot that year, which is about $13,000 in today's dollars. The other boat was the Molly Dozier, whose captain was Fred Dozier, and a boat was named for his wife. It left the next day. Why am I not showing you a photo of the Dozier? Well, because we couldn't find one. We looked and looked and looked. Vicki and I looked for it. We couldn't find one. If you know where one's at, or if you have one, please let me know, because I'd like to be able to use it in this talk if and when I give it again. Well, the Lewis was pretty far ahead. It had a day's head start. But by April 15th, the Dozier caught up with it. And then further upriver, the crafty pilot of the Lewis used a cutoff to get ahead of the Dozier, while the Dozier went all the way around a bend. The two boats approached an island near today's Vermilion, South Dakota. They were neck and neck. The Lewis went right, the Dozier went left. This time the Dozier made the right decision, and it opened up a lead of about 2.5 miles. Then they both encountered an ice field. The Dozier ran aground and the Lewis retook the lead. The Dozier got off one sandbar only to run aground on another and had to grasshopper or walk over it with its spars, such as these, to get going again. But they closed again, and then a strong current carried the Lewis into the Dozier and somewhat damaged it. The Lewis ended up winning the race by actually quite a bit. It arrived at Fort Benton on May 31st, 4:30 a.m., 33 hours and 45 minutes before the Dozier. But both of these boats had a profitable trip. The Lewis earned a $60,000 profit. equal to about $1 million today. The Dozier earned a profit of $50,000, equal to maybe $800,000 a day. Well, the Dozier struck a snag opposite Chamois and sank on October 30th, 1866. Attempts at salvaging the Dozier failed, and that place became known as the Molly Dozier Chute. In 1879, September of that year, the George Spangler struck the Dozier's wreck and sunk on top of it. The Lewis sank near Grand Tower, Illinois, on the Mississippi River, about 30 miles north of Cape, in 1873. It was salvaged, and its equipment was installed in a new boat under the same name in 1874. But that boat burned at Chester, Illinois, in 1875. This is the Far West. The Far West is probably the most famous Missouri River steamboat at its time. And even today, it may be the only one that people might recognize by name. Its captain in June of 1876 was the well-known, even legendary Captain Grant Marsh. The boat was moored at the mouth of Little Bighorn River. And a few days after that battle, it took on survivors of the 7th Cavalry from Major Reno's battalion, some 50 men or so, and the only survivor from Custer's battalion, the horse Comanche. This boat drew 20 inches unloaded, 200 tons of freight that drew 30 inches, 2.5 feet. And its 3 boilers use up to 30 cords of wood per day. Marsh was ordered to take the boat, go down to take the wounded down to Bismarck as quickly as he possibly could. He left, and the trip is legendary. It covered 710 miles in only 54 hours, an average speed of about 13 miles an hour, which doesn't seem like much to us today, but it was the 19th century equivalent of light speed on the river. Now, Grant Marsh wasn't the only well-known riverman who commanded the Far West. Henry Dodd became part owner of the vessel in 1883, along with Victor Bonnet, whose fathers built a mill across from Dodd's Island, Bonnet's Mill. Dodd's Island was later, it was around the mouth of the Osage River, and the Osage Chute, which ran past the mouth of the river, was another dangerous chute on the river. It was eventually closed up, and it doesn't exist anymore today. Well, the partnership that Dodd had in the Far West didn't last long. It came down on its last trip in October of 1883. Was heavily loaded with wheat, livestock, tobacco, barrel hoops, and other freight. It landed at St. Charles to wait for daylight. The stretch of the river from St. Charles to its mouth was always a dangerous piece of water. Dodd decided to hit the St. Charles bars, while his brother Sterling, who was the pilot on this trip, stayed on board. At about 2 a.m., Henry came on board roaring drunk. He woke up the entire crew and announced, "We're going down the river to St. Louis right now, immediately." But Sterling pleaded with his brother to wait until daylight, but the whiskey made the old man brave, he said. Sterling went to the pilot house. They backed the boat out into the river. But about 7 miles below St. Charles, near the head of Melanphy Island, the Far West struck a snag in 6 feet of water and sank. Fortunately, the Fannie Lewis was nearby, took most of the cargo and everyone on board, and saved everyone. There were no casualties. Now, this is a boat that modern day archaeologists have been attempting to find, but no one's been able to locate its remains, probably because it was salvaged and it probably removed the boilers and other metal parts, which really are what are used to locate these boats. And I have read that in the 20s, whatever was left after that was torn up when a dredge came by, dredging the river. If you want to know how they find these boats, watch that episode from Beyond Oak Island, where Dave Hawley explains how they use metal detectors to locate the boilers and other metal parts, and then try to get the outline of the boat from that. This is Joseph LaBarge, and I'm told that at least some of the members, or one of the members of your group, is related to LaBarge. So I'm going to tell a little story about Joseph LaBarge and the 4 Emilies. The first Emilie was not a LaBarge boat. It was engaged in the fur trade, sank in 1842 in the Emily Bend upriver from Washington. But the second Emily was built by Joseph LaBarge in 1859. LaBarge said it was an exceedingly beautiful craft. It was named after one of his daughters. It was a side wheeler, 225 feet long, 32 feet beam, and a hull was 6 feet deep. And LaBarge had many interesting experiences with this boat. Shortly after the Emily was completed, LaBarge agreed with the Hannibal and St. Joseph Railroad to carry passengers and freight from St. Joseph to Omaha and Kansas City or Westport, and to various points in between. In August 1859, a politician named Abraham Lincoln arrived at St. Joseph by railroad and took a steamboat to Council Bluffs to look at some land mortgaged to him as security for a debt. He was persuaded to make a speech on the slavery question, which was not well received by the local Democratic newspaper in St. Joseph. And he returned to St. Joseph the next day by boat. Lincoln returned in December 1859, once again traveling by rail to St. Joseph. He crossed the river from St. Joseph to Elwood, Kansas, and traveled through eastern Kansas down to Leavenworth, giving speeches all along the way. And after a few days, he returned to St. Joseph on a boat to catch the train home. Joseph LaBarge claimed to have met Lincoln on one of these trips, so he couldn't remember which one. And given that his contract with the railroad to provide those kinds of trips, it's likely that Lincoln did travel on the Emily on at least one of his trips in the river, because that's what the boat was hired to do. The Emily was still working for the Hannibal and St. Joseph in 1861, when it first got caught up in the travails of the Civil War. The barge came down from Omaha, stopped at St. Joseph to pick up passengers and freight for points south. But after the boat pulled out into the stream, many of the passengers on the boat went to the upper deck and let out resounding cheers for Jefferson Davis. Someone in St. Joseph telegraphed word of this to Leavenworth. The rabid Unionists held a meeting and decided that they were going to hang Captain LaBarge when the Emily docked in that city. Alexander Majors, who's one of the partners in the prominent shipping firm of Russell, Majors, and Waddell, and a friend of LaBarge's, was in Leavenworth waiting to go home to Lexington. As soon as the Emily touched the shore, Majors jumped on board and told LaBarge not to tie up or he was going to be hanged. He immediately backed the vessel off the shore and proceeded downriver, and of course, it survived. In June 1861, soldiers from the Missouri State Guard, who had been routed by General Nathaniel Lyon at the Battle of Boonville, boarded the Emily and demanded at gunpoint that LaBarge take their commander, General Sterling Price, who had fallen ill, back upriver to Lexington. LaBarge complied, but with a lot of misgivings, because he knew he had to face Union authorities when he finally reached St. Louis. After he landed there, he was brought before General Nathaniel Lyon to explain why he'd helped the Confederate general to escape. LaBarge produced a letter from Price affirming that LaBarge had acted under duress, but Lyon wasn't impressed. Lyon asked him if he knew anyone in St. Louis who could vouch for him. Well, LaBarge was a good friend with Frank Blair, and he suggested that Lyon talk to him. And Frank Blair, of course, was one of the prominent Unionists in the city, a staunch Lyon supporter, and one of the people who essentially saved the city of St. Louis for the Union. Blair met with Lyon and convinced him to release LaBarge. LaBarge had one more, and the Emily had one more last adventure in the Civil War. The Confederate Colonel Joseph Porter came to Missouri in the summer of 1862 to recruit men for the Confederate Army. And after several skirmishes north of the river in northeastern Missouri at Moore's Mill near Fulton and Kirksville and other places, he led about 300 men to Portland on the Missouri River in southeast Callaway County. There they waited for a steamboat to come. The Emily appeared, stopped to drop off 2 passengers. The Confederate recruits were hiding in the woodpile. When the boat landed, they rushed it, ambushed it, jumped on board, and compelled LaBarge to load all of his freight. They required him to take 175 recruits and their horses on board the trip and take them across the river to the south side. But that was all it cost, because when they came back, federal cavalry from the Missouri State Militia had caught up with the rest of them before the Emily had actually returned. The cavalry drove the rebels away from the steamboat landing, chased them up the north bank of the river, killing 7 of them. Well, the discovery of gold in the Montana Territory during the Civil War revived the Missouri River traffic, despite the dangers offered by marauding guerrillas and other dangers that steamboats normally faced. LaBarge sold the Emily in the winter of 1862-63 to the railroad, and the boat continued to ply the Missouri River on behalf of the railroad until 1868, when it was destroyed in a tornado that hit St. Joseph. Joseph LaBarge spent $60,000 building his next boat, the Emily LaBarge. Unfortunately, river traffic to the Montana territory fell off as the gold rush sort of cooled, and he made a trip to Upper Missouri in the 1870, and then finally confined the Emily LaBarge's trips to trade between Omaha and St. Louis. LaBarge sold the boat for $30,000 in 1871. She sank when she hit a snag in the Nashville Bend below Providence on June 4th, 1874. Now, the fourth Emily, that wasn't a LaBarge boat either. It was built in Wisconsin, ended up being sold to the US government, and it was destroyed by ice in 1885. Now, there are remains of another famous boat near St. Charles, Missouri, the Montana, where when the river conditions are right, when the river is low or very low, you can actually see what's left of it. This is a photograph of the Montana when it was still in one piece. It was described by one writer as a behemoth, as long as a football field and nearly as wide. It carried 100 passengers in luxury and could carry up to 600 tons of cargo, all while drawing only about 4 feet of water. It was one of the two largest steamboats to operate on the Missouri River in the 19th century. On June 22nd, 1884, the Montana was on a run from St. Louis to Kansas City when it docked, landed at St. Charles. The Montana was piloted by one of the legendary captains of the Missouri River, and one of my favorites, William Rodney Massey. Massey was born near Herman. He began working on the river in the 1840s and was still serving as a captain at the age of 78 when he came to blows with Captain Grant Marsh, who was then 73, because Marsh had criticized the company that Massey was working for. You can imagine these two old guys getting into a fist fight in the age of 70. Massey was not only well known for his prowess as a riverboat captain, but also as a gambler. He was playing cards with Wild Bill Hickok in Deadwood when Wild Bill was dealt aces and eights and shot by Jack McCall. The bullet traveled through Wild Bill's skull and lodged in Massey's wrist. Massey never had the bullet removed, and in subsequent years, when he arrived at Bismarck or other destination ports, he would come off the boat and announce that the bullet that killed Wild Bill is back in town. But on that June morning in 1884, all of Massey's skill could not save the Montana. It struck the railroad bridge at St. Charles, probably this pier right here, and sank in a matter of minutes. Within days, a salvage boat removed everything of value, leaving only the hulk, and about 2/3 of its hull was covered up by the waters of the Missouri River. This was actually very common. These boats were frequently, they'd take pieces of these boats, the boilers, the engines, the wood from the superstructure, almost everything except possibly the hull. Sometimes they'd even take the hull if it wasn't damaged too severely and build another boat on top of it. That's actually the way the Bertrand was built, for example. So the salvors and the steamboat builders of the 19th century were actually one of the first recyclers in the United States. Well, a few months after the Montana sank, after it struck the bridge in St. Charles, John Gonzalez, the captain of the Montana sister ship, the Dakota, struck a snag near Providence Bend. And Massey rather sarcastically asked, how could Gonzalez have failed to see a stump that was prominent as the one right there in that bend? To which Gonzalez replied, well, the stump wasn't nearly as prominent as the St. Charles Railroad Bridge. In any event, when the river is very low, very, very low, you can see the hulk of the Montana that rises up like a ghost out of the river and see what's left of one of the mightiest boats ever to sail the Missouri. Now, the Arabia, which I've been frequently asked about, in fact, whenever I give this talk or whenever people find out we've written a book about steamboat disasters, they always say, what about the Arabia? I'll cover the Arabia in a minute, but because it is probably the most famous one that's been recovered. But it wasn't the first steamboat to entice treasure hunters. It wasn't even the first one to be excavated and displayed. That was the Bertrand. This painting of it here showing the Bertrand sinking up near DeSoto, Nebraska. And it's now, it was recovered in 1969. Artifacts were taken off the boat, put into a museum in the DeSoto National Fish and Wildlife Reserve north of Omaha, which is actually on the Iowa side of the river. And then whatever was left of the hull was covered up, allowed to be covered up again by water. And so that was the first time that a boat like that was, and artifacts from it were recovered some 20 years or so before the Arabia itself was recovered. Incidentally, the captain of the Arabia, when it sank, was this man, Horace Bixby. Now, when I give this talk in person, I usually say, is anybody here? Raise your hand if you know who Horace Bixby is. And sometimes people do, but frequently they don't. Horace Bixby was a man who taught Mark Twain how to be a Mississippi River pilot. And you can read all about it in Life on the Mississippi. Well, treasure hunters in the 19th century weren't just looking for gold or that sort of thing on these sunken steamboats. They were looking for whiskey, or in the case of the Bertrand, which was carrying mining supplies, mercury, which was very valuable, very expensive, and was probably actually recovered from the Bertrand shortly after it sank. Now on to the Arabia. Well, in September of 1856, the Arabia was headed for Logan, Nebraska with 200 tons of cargo and 130 passengers. Opposite Parkville, Missouri, it struck a snag and sank in minutes. This is the snag. It's in the museum in Kansas City. Supposedly, this is a snag that was found in the hull of the Arabia. If it wasn't, it's certainly very much like the one that did sink it. There were no human casualties on the boat when it sank. People were able to get away quickly. But there was one casualty, a mule, which the owner said was too stubborn to jump in the water, and so it went down with the ship, sank, and was drowned. However, if you go to the museum, you'll see that that story was proved to be false about 130 years later, because they found the mule's skull, and you see that he is still attached to a piece of the boat. And so the mule couldn't get off the boat. There had been several attempts to find the Arabia over a number of years, but the major problem was that the river channel had moved, and it wasn't exactly clear where it was. This photo shows the location of the Arabia in relation to the current channel. It's maybe, say, 400 yards or so from the channel opposite Parkville. It was in a cornfield. And the Hawleys wrote a book called Treasure in a Cornfield, which I can highly recommend. They tell the entire story about how the boat was discovered and recovered. It wasn't easy to find that boat, and it wasn't easy to excavate it either. It was a constant battle with water, even though it was no longer in the river. They would dig and the water would fill the hole. And so they had to install pumps, and lots of pumps, and they had to have pumps, had to have fuel, and the pumps and the fuel cost money, and it cost lots of it. They'd planned to spend about $250,000 to excavate the boat, but they ran through that amount before they'd even located it. The Hawleys ended up spending millions of dollars to excavate the Arabia. It actually was their second attempt to excavate a historic steamboat. They'd first tried to recover the Missouri Packet, a boat dating back to the earliest days of navigation on the Missouri River, which sank probably in the 1820s. But they used heavy machinery to do the work when they dug it out in an attempt to save money, and the wreck itself was destroyed. And the only significant find that survived the excavation was the steam engine from the boat, which is now on display at the Arabian Museum. But they had learned their lesson. And after weeks of hard work, it had to be done in the winter to protect the artifacts and to allow the landowner to use its cornfield in season. They had found their treasure, and here it was. It was expensive. It was a frustrating dig. But when they discovered the first cache or artifacts, their elation wiped out all of their past troubles and frustrations. It was, one of them said, like every day was Christmas. Now, these artifacts, some of which are shown here, had to be stored someplace. They had to be restored so they could be displayed or used, and they had to be preserved. Now, they'd been in a perfect environment for over 100 years, underground, away from the air that could expose them. In fact, when some of the artifacts from the Bertrand were brought up. They had crates that had the names of the businesses that were either the consignees or the shippers. They took photographs of them, but within hours after exposure to the air, all of those words, all those painting on the side of the crate disappeared. Where would they put these artifacts? Well, some were stored in restaurant freezers that were owned by a team member, and they rented a cave near Kansas City for others. And none of the members of the Hawley team had any experience or training in preserving or restoring artifacts. They had no credentials. They weren't professional archaeologists. They sought out help from professionals in the United States, but they declined to help them. They finally got information and advice they needed from Canada and England. And today at the museum, of course, they do have professionals who continue to work on restoration of the thousands of artifacts rescued from the soil of a Kansas cornfield. While we were there recently, or we were there working on the book, one of the persons who was restoring artifacts was working on a boot. And she said it would take her 3 days to restore and treat just this one boot. And of course, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of similar kinds of artifacts. And you can see some of them here. Various kinds of goods, perfectly preserved, clothes, household goods, fine china, keys, doorknobs, guns, even cognac, which one team member took a sample of and said it wasn't too bad. And I think they even ate a pickle just to see what it was like. There was one of them there. There's some beads that were recovered. It was sort of like a 19th century Walmart, almost anything you would need in order to survive. And some of it was amazingly modern. Some of these doorknobs and these other items are things that you would see, you could see them today and say, oh, well, I've seen those. It's like what my parents had or what my grandparents had. You find them in some of the older houses still around. Some fine china. It was really, really amazing if you haven't seen them. These artifacts were actually more valuable than gold, although they did find 26.5 cents in cash. And they didn't find any whiskey, just the cognac. But these were perfectly preserved examples of what people in the 1850s used in their everyday life. Kind of tells the story. The museum itself tells the story of the steamboat and its sinking and its recovery, and the people who tried to recover it, and the people who did recover it, as well as the everyday lives of the people who wanted to use and did use and wanted to use these kinds of things that were recovered, these artifacts were recovered. It's in downtown Kansas City, and if you haven't visited it, I urge you to do so. I've heard that they may be moving in a few years when their lease runs out, because Kansas City is going to be doing some development in the area that wouldn't be compatible with a steamboat museum. And I don't know if it's going to move. I don't know if the rumors are exactly true, but if it does move, I hope that it moves someplace on the Missouri River and someplace in the state of Missouri. Now, the Hawleys, if you watch the TV show, are out looking for some other steamboats. One of them is the Malta, located near Malta Bend, named after the Malta that sank there. They have to go about it a little bit different from the way they did in 1988, because now there are state and federal laws that require, for example, professional archaeologists to supervise the site. But this is a result of one of their first expeditions to try to find the Malta. And again, if you watch the TV show, Dave Hawley explains how they use a metal detector to try to find the boilers, and then knowing how long and how wide the boat was, and generally the orientation of it, they would go down and drill down to try to find pieces of the boat so they could find basically the outline of it, and they would know where to dig. They're actively looking for the Malta. And according to the television show, they're also looking for a boat called the Radnor, which sank in 1846, apparently not too far away from the Malta. I think it was maybe between Arrow Rock and Jefferson City, but it's supposedly still in the river itself. And he explains how they might try to recover that boat if they find it and are able to recover it. In any event, even if they only find one, or if they only find two, they may be the next big find of steamboats in the country. I think Dave Hawley said on the TV show he was trying to find a steamboat from each decade of the steamboat era. And the Malta, I think, was 1839. The Radnor was 1846. I think I've got that right. The Arabia was 1850s. and so on. Well, the golden era of the steamboat extended from the 1840s to the end of the Civil War. Why did it end? One word: railroads. Railroads began to replace steamboats as the principal mode of transportation, not only in the East, but in the Midwest, the West, and the South. Railroads built bridges across the Mississippi and Missouri, incidentally creating new hazards for steamboats, so you see with the Montana. The railroads weren't confined to the major rivers. The rails could be laid anywhere there was a need. They could travel directly across the country. They could cross mountain ranges, and they could carry freight and passengers more quickly, but not always more safely, than the steamboats. A steamboat was considered fast if it could make 8 miles an hour going upstream on the Missouri River. Railroads, of course, could probably go much faster than that and carry as much or more cargo and as many or more passengers than steamboats. Railroads have their own romance, and many of the relics of this steam era of railroads can still be enjoyed at various museums. Maybe you were fortunate enough to see the big boy when it came through Missouri in, I think it was August of last year. And you can go to the National Transportation Museum in St. Louis County and see a number of railroad locomotives and cars and so forth. And also there are railroad museums and operating steam locomotives, mainly tourist roads all over the country. I don't think there's any steamboats still operating. Certainly there are not any boats that are from the golden age of the mid to early 19th century, still in existence, at least those who are not in a museum in pieces, like the Arabia or the Bertrand. But they were, in fact, an important part of the settlement of the American West. Nathaniel Philbrick described the Missouri River steamboat very aptly, I think, as an amphibious watercraft that ranks with the Bowie knife, the barbed wire, and the Colt revolver as one of the quintessential innovations of the American West. Well, thank you very much. I'd be glad to answer any questions. It looked like we have a lot of things in the Q&A and chat, so I'll be glad to answer those now. I'm going to stop sharing and get back to myself here. So Steve, you want to ask those?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and walk through some of these questions for you, James. So first of all, Maxine Sandman was asking what a spar is. You talked about spars several times, kind of an interesting piece of the toolbox of a steamboat.
The spar was, how would I describe it? It was a long, thin piece of wood, very sturdy, like a pole. Basically, it's like a pole, I guess is probably the best way to describe it. It was on the bow of the boat, and there would be one on each side. And then when they would use it to load cargo with, you could, put cargo on and then turn them around and load it onto the deck if it was very heavy. When they used it to grasshopper or walk, they would put them down at a 45-degree angle, and then the boat would come up like that. And then they would hook them back out again and put them up like that, and they pull them over and pull the boat over the sandbar. The alternative to doing that was either to unload the boat and get it light enough to go over the sandbar, or to get people or animals or something to hook a rope up and pull it over the sandbar. The grasshoppering or walking the boat was actually the preferred method. And that's, the spars were used, to load cargo, unload cargo, and to walk the boats.
Awesome. Barney Combs has a couple questions, and one, he was just wondering if you could comment on the importance and the contributions of both the enslaved and free Black men and women to the steamboat trade, because they were always a really important part of this Missouri River steamboat trade, but they weren't always necessarily even allowed on shore in some of the towns that they worked at.
Well, that's true. They actually made up a large part of the crews. They would be the deck crews or roustabouts working, those who worked with the engineer feeding the boilers. That was primarily that. They were many of them were actually hired out by their owners. Seems very weird to say that these days, but that's that's the way they did it. And then of course the others who might work in other capacities, such as what we call a steward or a cook, most of them were deckhands. And they made up a large percentage of the actual crews of the boat. Now, I don't think any of them were ever officers of the boats, but you know, they did make up the crews.
Yeah, I've actually read stories too where I think Washington, Missouri is one example that I read about where, or maybe it might actually have been Herman in one of Heckman's old journals, where he talked about how some of the boats that would land there, their crews were predominantly free blacks,
Right.
and they wouldn't be allowed in town after night. So the boats would literally have to go across the river and tie up for the night, and then come back so that those crews could load stuff onto the boats.
Right. And there were similar kinds of stories. I guess St. Louis, it wasn't quite, couldn't quite be as restrictive as that, but there are some kind of horror stories that come out of St. Louis about the way some of those crew members were treated when they were on shore.
Let's see. I don't know that you would have this answer, but John Weber's asking, and so I'm just going to ask the whole group because maybe somebody here does know. What are the steamboat remains visible at California Island here in Boone County? And I can say that I've heard people say that those wood beams are part of an old wooden barge. I've heard it say that they were part of a tributary bridge that got washed into the river, ended up stuck on the island. I haven't heard anyone say, but maybe someone here.
I don't have a clue. I don't even know where that is, actually. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's right near Columbia, Missouri, on the Missouri River. And you know, last time I saw this, which was a few years ago, it's been buried by sand now, I believe. But it really was just kind of one large beam with some bolts in it that you could see. Robert Foley was asking, where were the hulls and steam engines built? Were there shipyards near St. Louis?
Most of the steamboats on the Mississippi and the Missouri were actually built on the Ohio River, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Louisville, and places like that. St. Louis did have a shipyard, and it was kind of a secondary center for building steamboats. At Carondelet. The Carondelet was also where, for example, the ironclads were built. Some of the ironclads were built during the Civil War. James Eads, the ones that they called the Turtles. And Mound City, Illinois was a place where they built ironclads during the Civil War. The main shipyards were, however, along the Ohio River. Most of the machinery was made in Pittsburgh, or somewhere along the Ohio River. I know there was some that was done in St. Louis, because I know there was, for example, a guy named Sam Gaddy who had I guess you'd call it sort of a foundry or something, where he made various parts for steamboats in St. Louis, but I don't know if he built the engines themselves. So the major part of the shipbuilding, about 2/3 of the boats were built somewhere along the Ohio River, from Pittsburgh down to Louisville. Actually, even today, or certainly when I first started practicing law in Jeffersonville, right across the river from Louisville was a major shipyard for modern day towboats and barges. I think it may still be. It was also a headquarters of a lot of the barge companies. But there was a substantial number of boats that were built in St. Louis. And then some of the very smaller boats, some of them were just people just like, built them somewhere along the river. There were a number that were built around on the Osage, or the mouth of the Osage, and the Gasconade. These were much smaller boats. Typically were ferry boats or very small boats that operated on the tributaries, that required a much smaller boat than the ones from the Missouri couldn't get up there very far. So you'd have to have a much smaller boat to take goods and passengers up and down those rivers.
Let's see. John Weber had another question. he just said, I'd love to hear more about steamboat hull construction, which is, you know, you could write a book about that. But in the typical species of
Somebody
wood.
has. I read
Yeah.
it. I didn't get all the technical stuff of it. My wife says you don't want to get into the micro stuff when you're giving one of these talks, just the macro. So, but somebody has written a book about it that really wasn't documented in the same way that, say, modern ships are. I mean, they weren't being built by marine engineers. These were just guys who were on the river who wanted to build a steamboat, and they kind of arrived at these various characteristics, the shallow hull and so forth, by trial and error. They tried to see what worked, and if it worked, then they built another one like it. And if it didn't work, then they would try something else. But they're actually, I don't know, I'm trying to look at my book to see if I have there is a book about it, though. I can tell you that. I can't remember exactly. I think that was published by some guy from like Texas A&M or something. It probably was his PhD thesis that got published. And I can't remember the name of it, but it might
that's okay.
You can look it up. You can look it up, right?
Yeah, they need to look at your bibliography and check that out. John was wondering about the species of wood used in particular. Is that something that you've come across?
Well, the hulls, of course, were made of heavier wood, I think like oak or something like that, but the superstructure was as light as they could get it, like some sort of pine, maybe a yellow pine or white pine. I'm not really an expert in wood, but it was as light as it could be, because the whole thing was with the steamboats was to make them as light so they drew as little water as possible. That's why they did not have iron hulls, at least until the point where they started developing diesel engines that had more power than a steam engine could do. And it's they didn't have propellers. They had these paddle wheels. They wanted to make it light. They wanted to make it so they could cross over sandbars that were, they could go in water that was 4 or 5 feet deep, even though it was fully loaded. And so the idea was whatever they had to have for the hull would be fairly heavy, because it had to take a lot of stress, but anything above the main deck as light as they could get it. And that's why you see on some of the fancier boats, these kind of like very fancy kind of things. And some of those, like the show boats or the big passenger boats that plied the Mississippi, had that, but it was not heavy. They wanted it as light as it could be. So it's a very light kind of a wood.
Let's see. There's also some discussion. I'm just going to kind of go through this, like about where the Arabia is going to end up. So somebody mentioned,
I know a couple places have been proposed. I think there's been a proposal to have it somewhere around Jefferson City. I know there's a group who's trying to get it, I believe, at the intersection of Interstate 70 and Highway 65 near Marshall. There's some land there, and I've seen a proposal that they have prepared. I don't know who's seen it, who's supposed to make that decision. I guess the owners, I guess the Hawleys would, with the idea that, there would be not just the Arabia, there would be other boats there. And I think Malta Bend isn't too far away from that area. So if they did recover the Malta Bend, then that would be another boat that would go in there. And there may be some other places. I don't know what other places they looked at. Those are the two that I've heard about anyway. And it's only, I've seen something for the Marshall. I don't know anything about the one in Jefferson City other than kind of a rumor going around, and, I'm cleared for rumor, but I don't know much more than that. Any details.
Yeah, right. I've heard all those too. There's even people, I think, in St. Charles vying for it.
There were at one time.
There's kind of a good radio interview with David Hawley.
Oh, good.
From, I think, KCUR in Kansas City, that we linked to from our webpage about this event, which you can listen to. It's a good half-hour talk, and he goes a little bit more into some of the different locations that are vying for this. And the Marshall folks are sort of pretending like they've got it, like they're, and so they're in that sort of fundraising stage. And it's kind of funny to read their materials there. They sort of make it sound like it's a done deal, but according to Dave Hawley, it's not a done deal.
A lot of work into it. I don't know how I mean, they seem to have a very complete kind of a proposal, but I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I hope
So
it's somewhere in Missouri, wherever it is.
me too. Yeah. Yeah. I would love it to be on the Missouri River.
Yeah.
So Craig Pockert, in fact, I should just say this, like there's this really cool location in Kansas City. It's the old Samstown Casino right on the Missouri River.
Mhm.
And it's been an office building for the Cerner Corporation for several years, but my understanding is they're trying to sell it. And it just seems like the perfect place for a river museum. So I'll just put that out there.
There you go.
That my friend Ramjet there in Kansas City is always vying for that. Craig Pockert is asking if there's any idea of the percentage of boats that made it through the era without being destroyed or sunk.
Probably it's not a very high percentage. No, seriously, I mean, these boats, like I say, the average age of a boat on the Missouri River was 3 years. So something happened to it after 3 years, or they, tore it apart, or maybe it went somewhere else. It was 6 years on the Mississippi, which shows you how much harder it was to survive on the Missouri. I mean, it's the 300 or so that I talk about that sank on the Missouri River. There were obviously many more who sank in the Mississippi and Ohio. So I couldn't really give a percentage, but you think about that many sank and how many were operating at any one time. Maybe in a really busy year, there might have been 30 or 40 boats on the river on the Missouri, and maybe not even that many. Kind of hard for me to give an answer to that. But a large percentage of them eventually sank. Some of them sank 2 or 3 times. I mean, if they could salvage the boat, it was easier to just raise it, patch the hole, and keep on going until the thing completely fell apart or got to a point where it couldn't be salvaged at all. The TF Eckert, which I showed the picture of it, salvaging the Montana, salvaged like 600 boats. Now that was all over the Western Missouri River system, not just in Missouri or the Missouri River, but that boat alone salvaged 600 boats. And sometimes it salvaged the same boat 2 or 3 times. And Eads, for example, he was a guy who like made his money salvaging boats, came up with the diving bell and the submarine and all that kind of stuff. And, there was a lot of money to be made in recovering the boats and salvaging them because they sank a lot.
Andrew Roberts is asking, he's read about steamboats traveling up the Osage River. Was there much traffic on the Gasconade? And if so, do you know of any steamboat wrecks in that river?
I know there are wrecks at the mouth of the river because they sank. I think one of the last ones we talked about in our book were a couple of dredges, government boats that sank at the mouth of the Gasconade. One of them caught on fire. I think that was kind of a port for some of the government boats that worked in the river. I don't know. I think maybe there were some smaller boats. I think Heckman may have had some stuff in his books about, and then there was the woman's name had some other books about steamboats.
Dorothy Schrader.
Who? Dorothy
Schrader.
Yeah, Schrader, who had some about the boats that operated on the tributaries. I believe in the Osage, I read that the furthest that any boat ever got up the Osage, one year it flooded, it was very high, and they got as far as Warsaw. But that was extremely unusual.
Yeah.
And they had smaller boats that worked there. And of course, by 1859 or so, the railroad had reached the Gasconade and the Osage, went to Jeff City. And, once the railroad comes someplace that's close to people who need to travel or to send goods or receive goods, then it tended to take over traffic from the steamboats. Now they would cut a deal with the railroads. You got to Jeff City, we'll take them the rest of the way up the river and stuff like that. But once they got to Kansas City, a lot of the trade in the river from St. Louis to Kansas City fell because you could go on the railroad. and it was probably cheaper, and it was probably quicker.
Yeah, and just to sort of reiterate, you mentioned Bill Heckman's writings, and then I believe his granddaughter was Dorothy Heckman Schrader,
Yes.
who wrote 3 books, and a lot of those were compilations of things that Bill Heckman had written, but then others were like research that she'd done about family history related to the rivers. And she's got quite a few stories of the Heckmans going up the Gasconade River and the Osage River,
Right.
as well as just trying to piece together some sort of trade after the railroads had arrived, so they were still doing this kind of local packet trade, which was pretty interesting.
You see a lot of interesting photographs of these smaller boats, and people go on like excursions on the weekend. Or there was even a boat. I actually have used this a couple times in a talk, but it was, people asked how much horsepower were there in the steam engine, and there's a picture of a boat that was powered by horses, actual horses. I mean, they like are on a treadmill thing or something, that powered the boat. It was like a ferry boat that went from, the South Shore to the North Shore and back. Didn't go any great distance at all. Well, that one was at least 4 horsepower,
Yeah, I think there was a ferry boat like that at Rocheport, which is right near where I live.
Okay.
I've seen pictures of horse-driven ferry boat across. I think that was Rocheport.
Yeah, there were a lot of ferries like in Herman and Washington, that the smaller boats that went back and forth across the river or down the river a little ways, didn't go all the way to St. Louis or anything like that.
Let's see, popping back over to the Q&A here. They keep coming in. Are you open for more questions?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Hey, I got nowhere else to go.
Bill Muni was wondering, why did they not have decoy boats in front of their steamboats to detect snags well in advance?
Well, probably cost, I imagine. I mean, and they're not going to pay to have another steamboat go up ahead of them. I mean, they would just. That's why the pilots were paid so well. They were the ones who were supposed to either know where the snags were, or the sandbars were, or to be able to recognize them when they saw them. I mean, if you read Life on the Mississippi, you see the kind of training that Bixby gave Mark Twain about how to do that. You look at the currents and see things. The thing that surprised me, and I never could quite figure out, is how they do that at night. Or if it's raining or something, when the visibility is not that good. I'm sure like it's almost as much luck as anything else. And but I think he covers that in the book as well. So I think it's probably just a matter of cost. They pay the pilot to figure that out. They won't pay for another whole boat and crew to go up and do it. And if you had a rowboat or something, it probably wouldn't go fast enough.
Yeah, exactly. The steamboat, as slow as it was faster than a rowboat trying to go upstream.
Well, Mark Twain does say there were some places, when they encountered sandbars, that they actually would send out a rowboat, and that's when they would drop the, the Mark Twain. That's actually what that is how deep it is. But that was not typical. I mean, that was something they would do when they knew they were encountering something like that.
Something kind of related to that, Barney Combs is asking, have you heard of this term, eating up the lights?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've heard that either. I know that there's a Gary Lucy painting where there are some guys in small boats that are putting out floating lights on the river ahead of a steamboat to show where the deeper water is.
Oh,
and
well,
I can't remember what that was called, but it wasn't eating up the lights.
That could be it. They didn't really. Nowadays, I think they do have lights and other kinds of things on the rivers to provide warnings to the towboats and so forth that are going back and forth. But they didn't have that kind of thing in the 19th century. They actually. There's another whole book on this, but I'm going to go a little micro on you a little bit. My wife is going up there going crazy probably. Internal improvements were a big deal in the 19th century, and a question of where they should spend the money, or even if they should spend the money on improving the Western rivers, was kind of a big deal, a big political issue for years and years. And the internal improvements and the improvements for the waterways were divided up on the basis of population. And so Missouri, as you can imagine, did not have the same population as many of the states to the east. And so there were difficulties getting enough money even to hire, build, or operate the snag boats. And the snag boats would come up to Missouri and they would recover literally hundreds of snags. And they would either cut them up and put them on the shore, drag them away, and that sort of thing. But that was not something that was done every year because they didn't always have the money to do that. And well, anyway, it was
Yeah. Well,
it was an issue.
Well, I do have a friend, Scott, who calls the Missouri River sort of the neglected stepchild of the Western inland waterway system. So to this day, you know, it's we don't necessarily get the cash going on in these parts.
Didn't even in those days.
Yeah.
The snag boats was the most they would ever do, really. They didn't, there weren't any dredges or anything like that. Not in the
Okay, here we go. Eric, so last year, we had a really great steamboat presentation by Eric Reuter. And I probably am pronouncing his name wrong. Eric, I'm so sorry if that's true. But he mentions, well, in the chat, you guys, like if you're particularly interested in some of the boats about steamboats, he lists off some really good ones. He said steamboats were very active in the Osage. The Miller County Museum has a fair amount of information and photos, less on the Gasconade, but you can find accounts, blah, blah, blah. He said eating up the lights. It means that a small boat was set out ahead of the steamboat, which then ran down the floating lights.
Oh, okay.
So it was called eating up the lights because it ran right over him. So
Makes
that
sense.
I think is that painting that I was telling you about from Gary Lucy, right? And so it seems like something you would have to do going downstream, I guess. I mean, I don't know that you could have a small boat, you know, go up ahead of you upstream. I don't know. It'd be interesting to learn more about that.
It would be difficult, I suppose. I mean, they didn't run at night at first, and then later they, you know, started doing it. They didn't run at night for the very reason that they didn't, you know, were afraid they might hit a snag or whatever, run into a sandbar that they couldn't see and get stuck, you know. So yeah, but that makes sense though. Yeah.
So Norm Miller is wondering, like, who owns existing wrecks today? So like not the ones that have been excavated, but wrecks that potentially could still be out there. Well, like, is the Corps of Engineers, or is it the original owner, or is it like first come, first serve?
I believe the federal government asserts the right to ownership of anything that's in the waters. I believe. I think if you go on, I saw one of the U.S. Corps of Engineers websites or something. They said something to that effect. Now, if it was something like the Malta, which is 400 yards or more away from the river,
yeah, right,
under somebody's cornfield or soybean field, I think that is. I'm assuming that that's owned by the owner of the land, and you know, they own the land and everything that's under it, even if it's a steamboat. And so the Hawleys, as they did, I believe, with the landowner over in Kansas, would or anybody who was trying to recover those kind of boats would have to work a deal with the owner of the land. They actually did work a deal with the owner of the land, and they were going to, I think, give him, I don't know, he was going to sell some of the artifacts or something. He decided he just wanted to keep one and didn't want to sell them either. So I don't know the exact details of what it was, but I think if you read their book, they talk about that issue. But I do believe that if it's in the river, and that's why I wonder about the Radnor, I think if it's in the river, that's considered owned by the federal government because it's a navigable water of the United States.
Awesome.
I may be wrong, but I think I've seen something to that effect.
Well, I did look up real quick the painting by Gary Lucy, which I'm trying to share now, right? So
Oh,
This
yeah, very good.
called Eating Up the Lights.
Yeah.
And what Eric was saying in the chat is that, they would put these floating lights
Yeah.
deep part of the channel. So they're marking the deep areas, and then the boat would just run them over.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the deal when they were trying to make and you can also see, the moonlight. So right, they probably wouldn't be operating at night in the new moon, but maybe at the full moon there's enough light, you get some help out there. They figured out how to do it. And he also mentions that this was way more common on the Mississippi, where the current is a little slower than the Missouri, where it's
Yeah. Yeah.
more
Yeah.
rapid.
Yeah.
So that's kind of cool. Yay, Google. Uh, Barney also wants to mention the State Historical Society of Missouri has a lot of steamboat photos in their digital collection. So those are, pictures people can explore online.
Yeah, the EB Trail collection there is fantastic. EB Trail from Berger, I believe it is. And we relied upon it a lot for stuff in our book. And I have to admire the man. I mean, this was back in, I guess it's the 20th century now. And he went and got hundreds of steamboat photos, as well as other kinds of memorabilia and artifacts and what have you. And he got photographs. He didn't get digital photographs. He didn't do the internet. He jumped in his car or something, or corresponded with people. And if you want to do some research on steamboats, or want to find steamboat photos, or you want to see them, the actual photo themselves, as you see some digitized thing you like, or want to go find some that maybe aren't digitized, State Historical Society, it's a wonderful collection. We even have a little bit in the book, in a chapter about EB Trail and all the things that he did.
He was a doctor in Berger, is that right?
He was a dentist.
Dentist.
Yeah.
Pretty cool stuff. And Eric Reuter also wanted to mention that one of the biggest sources of steamboat in imagery is the digital collection at the University of Wisconsin and La Crosse too. So that's
we had some of the photos that we used in our book. They were very nice to us. The lady there managed to put me at the head of the line for getting photographs, because we had a deadline to submit them to the publisher, and I begged her to please just send me these 4. I know I'm like number 15 on the list, but can you just do it, because I need to get these in within a week? And she said no problem. She sent it to me. And really nice person, and really nice photos too. They had these. We got the Montana from them. The ones they have are mainly from the Mississippi River, but they did have the Montana.
Well, about the Montana, another question from Jeff Conderman. He asks, is there any information about the boat hull near the Foundry / Main Street, St. Charles? And I'm not aware of a boat hull there, but I would have to imagine maybe he's talking about the Montana, which is actually across the river. It's a little downstream of.
There's a boat landing on the St. Charles side.
Blanchette Landing.
Railroad bridge used to cross the new railroad bridge, and the interstate bridge is further north. And across from that, if you find that boat landing, or you find those foundations for the bridge, which I think one's at 3rd Street and something or other. And anyway, if you look straight across from there, then that's generally the location of the Montana, because as you can see from the photograph that I had, it hit the bridge and then came a little bit downstream before it finally sank. But that's the one. I'm sure that's the one he's talking about.
I would imagine. I'm not sure. So there is another long. Barney Combs shared a really long piece in the Q&A, if you guys are interested, about heating up the lights.
Okay.
I'm just going to have to copy that. I don't think I'm going to read the whole thing right now, but I'm going to save that for myself for later.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, Barney is on the board of Missouri River Relief. He actually just joined a couple weeks ago, and he's a heck of an amateur historian. He's constantly uncovering cool stuff. And I think that we've hit all the main questions that folks had. There's a lot of thank yous.
So somebody wanted to see the book again. Can I show it up again?
Oh, please do. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. There it is.
Super. So you can buy this directly through Acadia Publishing. And I just got another copy yesterday, and they are having a 30% sale right now on everything on their website. So if you go to Acadia Publishing, you can buy it straight from the publisher. Is there a better place where people could purchase from?
Well, if you're in St. Charles, you can get it at Main Street Books. Emily Hall has it there. I don't know. Since it's a couple of years old, Barnes and Noble may or may not still have an issue or two. Probably going straight to Arcadia or going to Emily if you're in St. Charles is probably the two best places to go. I mean, you can order it online. You know, you can get a digital. It's probably on Kindle too. I don't know, but I mean, you know, if you like to read your books that way, I mean, really, except for the covers, I don't think there's anything in color in it. So you can, you know, you're not gonna miss anything like that. But yeah, it's pretty much available online. Almost any place you can get an online book in Arcadia, and I know here in St. Louis, I think the Barnes and Noble in Des Peres has an issue or two still, and in Main Street Books is the main bookstore that has it. I'm trying to think of any others. I know the St. Louis area. I don't know about. I mean, they could order it from the publisher. You can go to the bookstore and they'll order it for you too. I mean, that's
absolutely. And that's always a good way to go, folks. You know, if you're interested in purchasing a book, if you've got a local bookstore that you can go to and they can order it for you.
I would urge you to do that. We owned a bookstore ourselves in St. Charles. In fact, it's Main Street Books, the one that Emily owns now. And I always say, if you're going to buy the book, I would prefer that you buy it through an independent bookstore, you know, like Skylark there in Columbia. I don't know if they carry it, but they can order it. And, you know, or there's one in, well, there's independent bookstores all over, but I'm just saying that's who I would recommend you get it from if you don't get it direct from the publisher.
Okay, so let's see. Jeff Conderman did reply. He said that the boat hull he's referring to is on the St. Charles side within feet of the foundry in the Katy Trail. So that's cool. That sounds like something to check out right now for use.
Okay, very good.
Something on the St. Charles side. So James, thank you so much for your time. These Q&A sessions can get out of control sometimes.
Hey, it's no problem.
We just love to get all of the extra stories that you've got. So there's a lot of thank yous in the Q&A and in the chat. People really appreciate the stories that you bring. That's what I really enjoyed. Some of the really funny stories about Joseph LaBarge and some of the other, you know, river characters.
I love the one about Massey and the
that's cool.
That killed Wild Bill.
Yeah,
yeah, and well, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it. I'm glad so many people, you know, logged on, and I'm so happy that we had so many people, and you know.
Well, hopefully we'll get to meet you soon, and when we're in St. Charles, we'll try to get you in a boat on the river. And
okay,
look forward to that, James. So thank
maybe
you.
We can find the Far West.
Yeah.
Or one of those others. There's a lot of them that sank around St. Charles, so we have plenty of options there.
Yep. Well, thank you to everybody for showing up tonight, and we'll see you next month for a talk about the Big Muddy Clean Sweep. You guys have a great evening.
Okay.